On July 13, 1863, as the second day of the new military draft lottery in New York City got underway, demonstrations broke out across the city in what began as an organized opposition to the first federally mandated conscription laws in the nation's history. But it soon morphed into a violent uprising against the city's wealthy elite, its African American residents, and the very idea of the Civil War itself. The New York City draft riots, which would wreak havoc in the city for 4 days and would remain the largest civilian insurrection in American history, exposed the deep racial, economic, and social divides that threatened to tear the nation's largest city apart in the midst of the American Civil War.
Racial and economic tensions grew in the first half of the Civil War. The passage of the Conscription Act of 1863 led to conflict on the city streets and suspension of basic rights. Compromise was reached between the Irish immigrants and the city councilmen, resulting in economic incentive and growth of the Irish in the military.
On March 3, 1863, the debate began when the conscription law was passed. Under this law, the act called upon all able-bodied men between the ages of 20 and 45 to military conscription. Under this act, conscripts were permitted to hire substitutes to take their place in the military. When the draft reached New York City, it impacted an urban industrialized center mainly populated by Italian, German, and Irish immigrants. Often unable to speak English, they were seen as poor outsiders by America's elite, and were not able to buy themselves out of war or support a family while fighting in a war. The city imposed a draft and allowed an assumption fee of $300, making controversy explode. People provided an out for anyone who participated in the draft by either hiring a substitute or paying the $300 fee. However, in the case of the lower class, all able-bodied men were forced to go, and were most likely the only source of money for the family. A letter to the editor of the New York Times stated, "You will no doubt be hard on those rioters tomorrow morning, but that $300 fee has made us nobodies, for whom nobody cares, and that we must go to war and be shot down. We are the poor rabble, and the rich rabble is our enemy by this law. Therefore, we will give our enemy battle right here."
Bait for the rage between immigrant groups on who and what was to blame, African Americans became the scapegoat for this resettlement. In the eyes of the workers, and if the war was won, African Americans from the South would flood the northern factories and provide an even cheaper source of labor, therefore pushing immigrants out of their jobs. President Lincoln added to these tensions as portraying the war as a way to save the African American slaves, leading to the immigrants blaming African Americans for the conscription. As tensions rose, political groups released propaganda to encourage fighting against conscription. Pamphlets by the abolitionists added fuel to the growing debate. Political parties used the draft in New York City to try and gain the political favor by blaming each other, with the Democrats accusing the Republicans of operating the machinery of the draft. During the 3-day riot, the mob raged into factories and stores, burning and destroying as they went, successfully halting all economic activity. The fury of the mob rendered the people utterly helpless. One newspaper described the rioters, "A half-dozen ragged, loafing fellows go into an establishment at which from 10 to 100 men work. They gave orders to the men to the concern to stop work. Instead of calling down the hands and with revolvers shooting the miscreants dead, the concern is closed. Owners were ordered to shut their establishment or the mob would burn them down." They stormed offices with various newspapers, some of which had spread falsehood to encourage the mob, while other newspapers criticized the mob's efforts. When the New York Sun stated that the main purpose of the draft was to create an army that would allow the United States to engage in war with England, to make writers become even more hostile to newspapers. After the New York Tribune article stated that the rioters were an extension of the Southern Rebel and its part in the Southern Confederacy, rioters stormed the Tribune offices as well. Many newspapers condemned the riots, fueling the rioters as supporters of anarchy and chaos, which led to the mob destroying the Troy Daily Times and cleaning out its offices. Witnesses described the scene. "We can hear the crashing of wood and glass. It was a storming party under competent and effective leadership."
One of the more destructive crimes committed against the New York City's African American population was the burning of the colored orphan asylum. It was visited by thousands of the rioters, the majority of whom were women and children. The rioters plundered the building all around. The building was purely a charitable institution. In it, there were an average of 600 to 800 colored orphans. The institute was destined to be burned. Many individuals fought against this outbreak. During the time of the orphan asylum, Chief Engineer Decker proved himself to be the bravest among the brave. After the entire building had been ransacked, the premises were fired among the first floor. Mr. Decker scattered around the building and extinguished the flames. On the front steps of the orphanage, he infuriated a half-drunk mob of 2,000 and begged them to do nothing so disgraceful to humanity as to burn up another institution. In the midst of the violence, several institutions gathered together in an attempt to restore calmness to the city. The merchants pulled together funds which they distributed to the African American victims in the form of shelter, food, and beds. Various individuals offered assistance to the African Americans by offering help for them to escape the havoc of the city.
Abraham Franklin, under living for himself and his mother by serving as coachman, scarcely had he risen from his knees after prayer when the mob broke down the door, seized him, beat him over the head with fists and clubs, and hanged him with the presence of his mother. Jeremiah Robinson, in order to escape, dressed himself in his wife's clothes and went towards danger. He wore a hoodie which failed to hide his beard. Some boys, seeing his beard, left it at the edge of the skirt, which exposed his heavy boots. Immediately, the mob set upon him and looked through his paperwork, which was indecent and unfit for publication. They finally killed him and threw his body into the river. There was a variety of opinion on how to deal with the uprising. The New York Times reported, "One gentleman contended with should shoot them down in the streets or wherever they stand." Ultimately, this opinion prevailed, and Lincoln's diplomatic solution would not be a peaceful one. He decided to respond to the chaos in New York City by sending in the army to squelch the mob. July 17th, they reported that the city was officially quiet. The rioters were whipped and left in the darkness without sympathy or consolation. Arrests were being made around the city, and soldiers were doing their job to bring the offenders to justice.
Immigrants of New York believed that there were white men fighting in a black man's war and poor men fighting in a rich man's war. They resented the draft for its economic implications for their family. Ultimately, the only viable diplomatic resolution was for the government to respond to the riots with force. Lincoln
Saw striking similarities between the New York rioters of the Confederates, and so he would treat them in the same manner to protect the Union. The New York City draft riots showcase a debate between an immigrant group and their struggles to achieve an American dream against the government that they felt was willing to sacrifice them for a cause they did not believe in. The government responded swiftly and violently, believing that the refusal of this group goes against the principles America was built upon.